Right. Good afternoon again. We are pleased to introduce Mrs. Lauren Para, the newly appointed Chief Bay and Water Resource Officers for Miami-Dade County. With extensive experience in stakeholder management and environmental communications, nonprofits and otherwise, Dr. Para has been a pivotal advocate.
No, not doctor.
This is Para. Has been a pivotal advocate for both science-driven policy and community management. Her career spans multiple influential roles, including, but not limited to, Senior Director of Communications for Miami-Dade, Mayor Daniela Levine Cava's office, where she focused on equitable access to government services, and as a regional director for the former U.S. Senator Bill Nelson, supporting Everglades restoration initiatives. In addition to these roles, Mrs. Para has managed a $10 million competitive grant program at the Everglades Foundation, fostering both innovation in water quality and the future for Miami-Dade. Her leadership has been instrumental in initiatives like Thrive 305 and the Biscayne Bay Specialty License Plate, which I have.
Wow.
Lauren holds a BA in Political Science and Sustainability Studies and an MBA from the University of Florida. We are thrilled to have her here and listen to her insights on the restoration and protection of Biscayne Bay's natural ecology through a blend of science, policy, and public collaboration. So everybody join me in giving a big FIU welcome to Dr. Brown. The experience. Okay, honorary doctor.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. I am thrilled to be here. I generally start my presentation, certainly to anyone in academia, with the statement that I am famously not a scientist. And I definitely don't have a PhD, but working with academia and scientists has been probably the bright spot of my professional career. And so I'm very grateful for the invitation. Thank you, Dr. Brock, for having me this afternoon. So just quickly, so that you guys know what to expect, I'm gonna share a little bit about myself, Chief Bay, give you all a little bit of history on sort of the environment, the regional environment, which frankly, I am sure half of you could give back to me tenfold. And then I'll share just a little bit more about some of the strategies that we're deploying at the county to actually reach some of that incremental restoration and improvement across Biscayne Bay. So just a little bit about myself. This is me on the water in 3 very different phases of my life. The first picture is the first time I was ever on a boat, and I believe that that is the Staten Island Ferry. The second picture is a photo of my husband and I, who I very purposely cut out because this is not about him. Instead about me and our cat Luna, who has her life vest on, and she also likes to recreate out on the water. And the last photo is a picture of me and Chief Carmen Castro. She is the Miami-Dade Police Department Division Chief that oversees the Miami-Dade Marine Patrol Unit. And that is, of course, a critical aspect and a critical tool that we deploy and count on when we think about Biscayne Bay restoration. So you guys heard a little bit about my professional history in that incredible introduction that I didn't write. Thank you so much. That was so generous. But just a little bit about me. That is a photo of myself, the first Chief Bay Officer, Arella, and Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniela Levine Cava. This was the unveiling of the Biscayne Bay license plate. I don't know if any of you were in Miami-Dade maybe 4 years ago. But when the state legislature gave us the approval to move forward on the license plate, we did this really fun community engagement where we did 3 designs and we had everybody vote on what design they would want to see. I was actually at the Miami Foundation at the time, which is the recipient, the holder of those funds. And when I showed up to do this with the mayor and the county, who was again like spearheading this project, the mayor was like, "We didn't bring a car." I'm like, "What do you mean you didn't bring a car?" And I was like, "Well, do you want to use my car?" So literally we peeled off my license plate with a little hand tool that, God bless my older brother, has always put in my glove compartment. And we put the winning design for the Biscayne Bay license plate, and I got to be a part of the whole unveiling. And fast forward 5 years later, it is now a huge part of the work that I do, because managing the Biscayne Bay license plate. A little bit about the mayor, and just this is relevant to my role. I'm sure many of you know this, but Mayor Danielle Levine-Cava is a strong county mayor, and that's relevant to a lot of the work that we do. But I want to ask the class, can anyone tell me what a strong county mayor in Miami-Dade means?
Veto power,
Say that again.
veto power.
Veto power, yes, that's certainly part of it. But really, so what I want to kind of share here is that map is all of Miami-Dade County. That, all that the light touches is what Mayor Danielle Levine-Cava has some agency over. But because of the very unique governance in Miami-Dade, we have 34 cities and municipalities, and each of them have their own mayors, and lots of them have their own city councils, their own village councils. And so earlier today, when we were having lunch, one of the students, I don't remember who, was telling me about the challenges of identifying ownership of public right-of-way. That is a challenge in large part because of this very unique governance structure that we have in Miami-Dade. It's really hard to recognize who manages the public right-of-way because it could be the county, it could be one of the cities, and of course, regional projects like restoration become more challenging when we have to work through and navigate some of that governance. So Biscayne Bay, and really just overarching why. Biscayne Bay is visually relevant to so many people that come in and out of Miami-Dade County. It's of course a huge economic engine. It houses not only some of Florida's most iconic species, including coral reefs, seagrasses, sea turtles, all the mangroves. It also houses our international port, which is the busiest cruise port in the world. Over 50% of international cruises come out of Port Miami. So really, Biscayne Bay is a huge resource, not only for all of the creatures who call it home, but certainly for all of the close to 3 million people who live in and around this community. So for a long time, certainly at the county, maybe not at the science level, there was a really big focus on water quality and really focusing on water quality being sort of the silver bullet to addressing restoration across Biscayne Bay. But as we've seen increases in the frequency and in the intensity of rain events, as we see more coastal storm surge, as we see the impacts of compound flooding, the mayor changed my title from Chief Bay Officer to Chief Bay and Water Resources Officer because she said there is no way that you were going to make a dent in nutrient reduction in Biscayne Bay if you are not talking to emergency management, if you are not talking to public works, if you are not talking to the South Florida Water Management District, who has a responsibility to move water to protect people and property. And so that has been sort of the new perspective at the county to really try and address and improve water quality across the watershed. It's really a triangle approach where we're of course always anchoring the science. It's why all of the work that's happening here at FIU and all of our academia in the region is so important. Policy is of course a huge aspect of our ability to actually implement a lot of the work that you guys are developing here at the universities. And infrastructure. Infrastructure is a huge component of nutrient loads going into the bay. But a lot of what I do, right, like I'm not exactly executing on science, I'm not building any new public right-of-ways, and I'm not really writing legislation, but a lot of what I do is figuring out what the strategic engagement is, what the communication is, what is the decision-making process that we can actually deploy to incorporate all of the developments in these 3 areas. So I thought about skipping through this because I'm confident that so many of you are profoundly familiar with the history of the region. But I will do it just because we have the time. The historic flow, Everglades, of course, which flanks either side of our incredible Miami-Dade. Transverse glades historically brought down water south, and really just used the beautiful force of gravity to bring down clean water both into Florida Bay and Biscayne Bay. And in an effort to keep this brief, I just always like to acknowledge, I am completely skipping over the historic Tequesta tribes and all of the original peoples who were in this region. I'm completely skipping over that because we do not have enough time to get into that. So for the purposes of this presentation, we're going straight to the 1920s, which is where we started to see a lot more development and a lot more population growth here in South Florida. People were homesteaders. They were very excited to be down in this like undeveloped land. They were explorers. They were sort of like, there's a lot of mosquitoes, but we're gonna work through it. But unfortunately, this was a community that was so new that they didn't necessarily have the technology to really communicate across the region when there were either oncoming storms or additional sort of environmental events. And because of that, we saw a lot of unexpected deaths. The region had its first really, really big named 1926 hurricane, winds of up to 150 miles per hour. And unfortunately, because people didn't know any better, they came outside during the eye of the storm, not knowing that this was quite literally the eye of the storm. And so dozens of people actually wound up dying during this hurricane because they didn't realize that the second half of the storm was coming right behind them. And so that's when the federal government was like, that's no good. We got to do something about that swamp because all that water, all that storm surge is, of course, a massive threat to the people who are residing in this area, but it is also a massive threat to all of the development that is up and coming. And so that's when the Army Corps of Engineers arrives and starts digging all of these canals that now all of us are very familiar with. It's when you're driving around the region, you see that little alligator next to a canal. That's a South Florida Water Management District managed canal. And those canals are used, of course, to move the water safely and keep it from flooding out all of the residential and hyper-developed areas. But of course, as you can see in some of these photos, a lot of that water winds up going into Biscayne Bay. And quickly, I mean, you know, I love some of these photos because they're really extraordinary just to see that so much of this was actually done by hand. And the work that happened, and you know, these fun facts about some of the soil that was pulled from all of these canals, they wound up creating some of the spoil islands that we have in Biscayne Bay today. Picnic Park, I think, a handful of the city of Miami spoil islands. They're called spoil islands because there's all this spoiled dirt and they created them. And now there's these huge recreational points for residents in Miami-Dade County. And even though they're not natural, they're oftentimes maybe the first place that people are engaging with Biscayne Bay. It's the first place that they're getting to know their natural environment. And so it's sort of this unintended consequence of all of this digging. But my point here really is around those original designs. They did not account for what we all know now is sea level rise. They certainly didn't account for water quality because the focus was always around movement, was around conveyances. And so that is a lot of the challenge that certainly Biscayne Bay sees now, because ahead of a storm, during increased rainfall, the district has an obligation to move water, but that water is never treated. It's really never treated. And I will say that in the past 10 years, the district has been such a great partner to the county in looking for places where we can actually deploy water quality technology to help treat some of that water before it goes into the bay. But unfortunately, from the beginning, the system was created to be to have two completely separate goals. And water quality was just never part of, you know, their end goal. So fast forward, I know that a handful of you are working on Everglades issues, but you know, some 100 years later, Everglades restoration is really successful. It is a winning issue on both sides of the aisle. It is, I have heard, the most successful environmental restoration, certainly in the country, probably one of the most successful in the world. And it's a really incredible project for this community to have sort of watched unravel over the past 40 years. And what I really want to kind of hone in on is that Everglades restoration became this very, very politically winning idea, right? Like you will not find a politician at any level in the state of Florida coming out against Everglades restoration. And that's a really powerful. So when we talk about Everglades, and I came up in Everglades work, I started my career at the Everglades Foundation. I never heard anybody talking about Biscayne Bay. And it wasn't until much later that I actually even started to ask myself the question of like, what's going on? Like these seem sort of like, you know, like one big one big water body. And as far as the average bear is concerned, it's all just water on the outskirts of the state of Florida. Can anyone tell me, do they have any guesses, any ideas, any theories as to why Biscayne Bay has generally been isolated from greater Everglades restoration?
The ridge, is it, cause it's close proximity to a lot of, a dense population, so maybe restoration is complicated.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the honest truth is it sort of depends on who you ask, but I think for our conversation, that's exactly right. So just like the most traditionally deployed technologies to clean water in greater Everglades restoration are generally STAs, and STAs require a lot of land. Virgin undeveloped land is very hard to come by in Miami-Dade County, and if you can find it, it is so expensive that neither the county or the district or the state can really come up with enough money to say, hey, we're gonna, you know, we're gonna save this land over here and use it exclusively for storage, filtration. We have great programs like the EEL program. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. But even those lands, they're not set aside for holding water. They're set aside for basically maintenance to keep them pristine. We know that they have a lot of natural value. But maybe in the last 10 years, I would say, Biscayne Bay sort of came into its own. And certainly in the last 5 years, the very, very visible fish kills that happened in the bay sort of put Biscayne Bay, I would say, on the map. It put it on the forefront of a lot of people, a lot of decision makers' minds, just because it was such an obvious threat to public safety, right? Like you don't want to be near the smell of a fish kill. You don't want to put your dog next to a fish kill, excuse me. And it was also just widely understood that this is a huge threat to the local economy. You will not find a developer who has land on the coast thinking that it is unimportant to invest in Biscayne Bay because nobody wants to buy a waterfront property when the water is full of dead fish. So with that, I think it's okay to move on to just some of those strategies that we're actually deploying at Miami-Dade County, excuse me. Which are again, science, policy, and infrastructure. So the lead project that I want to talk about here on the science front is the reasonable assurance plan that we're actually working on right now. So the reasonable assurance plan is exactly what it sounds like. It's essentially this like map that can provide reasonable assurance to the state of Florida that we can improve water quality in Biscayne Bay. The reason why we're moving forward on a RAP, there's two reasons. One, the state deemed several parts of Biscayne Bay as imperiled some time ago, and that is not good. That's not good. If we don't do something about it, we could face incredible fines. We could face consent decrees. They could threaten to take it over. It's not a good situation. So usually, the state or a local, or excuse me, the state or federal government would actually move forward with a BMAP. Can anybody tell me what a BMAP is? Really? I thought you guys would know. Okay. It's a basin management action plan, and those are much longer. And a BMAP is essentially the state coming down and saying, this is what you need to do. There's not a lot of room for discussion. It's very much, hey, we know best, and these are the interventions and the levels at which you're going to have to deploy these interventions. A RAP, a reasonable assurance plan, is actually led by the local government. So Miami-Dade County is the lead on the RAP. And it is literally built in a way that we can actually account for feedback from the community, but more, frankly, more importantly, from the local governments who are going to be allotted literal reductions in the nutrient load that they're dropping into the bay. So that's really important, because even if we had a BMAP going, right? Getting a local government to actually find the money and then invest the money in these nutrient reduction, either technologies, infrastructure, I mean, it's really tough. I don't have to tell you guys, but local governments are facing a lot of different problems. And if you're a decision maker and you have residents who are behind on their rents, you have public health issues, you have roads with potholes, it's actually really hard for some of these elected officials to say, no, what I'm going to invest in is water quality for a water body that if you're in Hialeah, you can't even see from your community. And so for us to move forward on a RAP was actually really, really important, and it's been a challenge, but we know that if we move forward with a RAP, we'll, one, see nutrient reduction a lot faster than if we were to move forward with a BMAP. Then we'll get a lot more buy-in from all of the cities and municipalities that are frankly gonna be responsible for lowering their nutrient. This slide of why is or was this hard is the crux of my presentation, and I'm hoping that we get some thoughts, and I want conversation on this. The RAP has been a very challenging project for us, and I'm happy to tell you guys why, but I'm more interested in hearing why some of you think that moving forward on a RAP might be difficult.
Many cooks.
Yes. That's right. There are 34 mayors that I have to talk to before I can get a RAP together. Even putting together this slide took me like 40 minutes to identify all of the mayors in all of the cities and municipalities, and I literally couldn't even fit all of them. And again, you can appreciate that talking to, say, folks on Miami Beach, whose entire city, their community, their identity is rooted in the water, it's a much easier conversation than, say, talking to folks in Kendall, right? That community doesn't feel the same level of connection to the water body. And so those are tougher conversations to say, hey guys, instead of deploying, for example, flooding mitigation, I need you to instead focus on water quality. That is actually, I would say, my biggest challenge, because increased flooding is so top of mind across Miami-Dade County. It's gonna be a huge discussion in the state legislature this year. And it behooves me to figure out ways that I can talk to elected officials and say, actually, if you figure out one wetland, if we take one city park and we remove your parking lot, and instead we make a really nice looking little wetland, that will actually help your flooding problem, but it'll also give me some nutrient reduction before that water goes into the bay. So a lot of what my team and I are doing, and we work very closely with scientists at Durham and a lot of the academia to figure out what those interventions are, because we know that decision makers have a lot of different places that they can put their money in. So anytime we can find co-benefits, that's really best. And then just a little bit about some of the additional science. And this slide came from one of my Durham colleagues, Pamela Sweeney. Shout out to the state of Florida, who has given us a fair amount of money to try funny little things like smart covers, which basically help us to prevent sanitary sewer overflows. That type of grant money to try things that maybe necessarily would be harder for us to fund in a regular county budget for all of the reasons that I already shared is really, really helpful. Because if we can make the point that it works at a small scale, maybe it's something that we can deploy across the county. But smart covers is one of the things that we're trying. And this year, we're actually gonna try a many person smart ponds, so. And on the policy front, the thing that I wanted to share with you all, and this was like a really, really big win. I don't know if anybody was following this, but we recently passed a massive ordinance change at the county called the Impervious Surfaces Ordinance. Can anyone tell me what the difference between an ordinance and like a normal piece of legislation passed at the BCC is? A piece of legislation is sort of like a piece of policy. It gets voted on by all the county commissioners, just like an ordinance change does. But when you think about an ordinance, it's basically like, it's in the building code almost of Miami-Dade County. You can repeal a policy pretty quickly. It's a lot harder to change ordinance codes, right? It's a lot harder to change building code. And so the impervious surface ordinance basically increased the amount of pervious surface that every residential and commercial development in Miami-Dade County has to include. So what we were seeing was a lot of residential homes. They have this beautiful backyard and they have this great pool and they're like, I want to pave over the entire yard so that we can enjoy all of this and hang out by the pool. But what did that mean? That meant that your neighbor to the right, who kept all of their grass, got all of their flood water. Anytime that it rained, you had all this water seeping into the neighbors. And so we were getting all these calls from people saying, what the hell? Like, my neighbor just won't stop pushing water into my neighborhood, into my backyard, excuse me. And so at a small scale, we were hoping to address this nuisance issue for residents, but at a much larger scale, starting in March of next year, every commercial development, no matter the size, is going to have to include additional pervious surface, additional storage in any of their developments. And so we won't see the benefits of that for a few years, but I just can't stress enough how much of a win this was. Because we're going to see additional storage options across the county.
What is the percentage of?
Couldn't tell you off the top of my head. I didn't write the ordinance, but I will find out. Can anyone tell me why passing that ordinance was very hard?
You're telling people what to do with their property, and people don't like it when you do that.
Yeah. Any other potential challenges? Because there were a lot of them before we got this passed. For us, it was really the variety of stakeholders that had something to say about this ordinance change. We had a lot of developers who were not happy about this because that meant either less parking that they could account for, it meant a larger lot size that they had to purchase to include the original number of units that they were planning for. We had a lot of pushback from developers. At the same time, we had a lot of advocates saying, this doesn't go far enough. You guys aren't doing enough. This should not grandfather in existing development. And you should make everyone who's ever built something in Miami-Dade County also increase their pervious surfaces. So, say nothing of your original point. Residents were like, what does this mean? What do you mean that I, who just spent my hard-earned money making my beautiful patio with these gorgeous pavers, have to now pull up all of my pavers because you told me that my neighbor was bad? Those are the challenges that we face when we're talking about implementation of the great ideas that we know are coming out of all of our universities. Implementation is really hard because everybody is affected by it. And that was just one example of all of the stakeholders that we had to manage.
And parking is required, right?
Parking
Parking is required.
Parking is required unless you're in an RTZ, a rapid transit zone.
Oh.
Yeah. But, and this is a fun fact, I was not in these meetings, but all the local governments, so an ordinance change impacts the entire county. So all the cities and municipalities have until the end of the year to either pass a similar ordinance change of their own or pass one even stronger. So that's really cool, right? Like maybe we get one or two cities who say, we're gonna go even further. That would be great, but everyone has to do it because this is an ordinance change. For us to get this passed, we had 42 meetings with individual cities and municipalities. There's only 34, so that means that at least 5 of them asked for follow-up meetings because they had so much to say on this policy. And that was, again, just one stakeholder. So when you think about the implementation of all of these ideas, there's just so much that goes into it before we can actually get that unanimous vote at the Board of County Commissioners, which was so historic and so valuable. There's just a lot of work that happened on the back end. And then the last thing here is just the back bay study, the darling of our infrastructure investments. Is anybody following or working on the Back Bay study? I actually get students who are following Back Bay reach out to us all the time. No one in this room? Okay. The Back Bay study is one of like 4 or 5 current projects that the US Army Corps of Engineers is moving forward in South Florida right now. I heard someone say that South Florida has more US Army Corps of Engineers projects happening than any other part of the country. I'm assuming it's because we are literally the canary in the coal mines. And if the Army Corps, the federal government, if the local governments can figure out a way to safely combat the effects of a changing climate, of sea level rise, they're hoping that whatever we figure out here, they can deploy across the entire eastern coast. And so the federal Back Bay study was originally a project to reduce coastal storm surge risk from Back Bay. That's not a term that I feel like people in Miami-Dade know very often, but it's actually used very commonly in the Northeast. And it's basically just like the downtown area, like the developed side of the bay, the Back Bay, so. Army Corps of Engineer projects historically take a really long time. They take decades. We know that Everglades restoration has been going on for upwards of 40 years, and maybe this project will not be any different. But we've actually seen a lot of really great progress. We got the Army Corps of Engineers to put out their initial chief's report in 12 months, which is like lightning speed for the Army Corps. And outside of it being incredibly fast, they are agreeing to try some really innovative stuff that they've never agreed to before. They've never tried before. And we're calling that multiple lines of defense. So the Army Corps is very, very good at building great infrastructure. But Miami-Dade County said that is not gonna work for us. We want other tools. We wanna see coral reefs and we wanna see mangrove forests. And we know that it's gonna have to be a hybrid approach. We know that we're not just gonna be able to reduce coastal storm surge entirely with our mangroves, but we definitely wanna make sure that we're incorporating some of that. And the Army Corps, from my understanding, is actually pointing to this project, they're pointing to Miami-Dade as a, hey, everybody, we can do things differently. Look at us down in Miami-Dade. When you have a local sponsor who's really pumped about the work and there's lots of expertise in the community, we can actually be more nimble in the projects that we're hoping to move forward. This is the last time I'm gonna ask, but can you guys start to guess why this was and has been and will be such a difficult project?
No one wants unsightly, you know.
Have you guys all seen this picture before? You know,
1.0.
you guys know who paid for this rendering? A developer.
Oh.
A developer paid for this because they were like, I'll be damned if you guys are gonna put some fat gray wall in front of my 5 hotels on the bay. And so Swire actually paid the design firm who put together all these renderings. And they became sort of the lead developer who brought along all the others and really grew the private sector response to, hey, Army Corps, I know you guys do this in other places, but that's just not gonna cut it in Miami-Dade. This is really just an opportunity for me to share this photo of me and Secretary Pete Buttigieg. That was taken at the port, and he's as wonderful as you might think. But outside of Back Bay study, we're doing lots of smaller infrastructure improvements as well. With the team that had lunch earlier, we were also talking about just the impacts of old septic tanks. My home is on septic. I have called my mayor personally to say, Mayor Lago, when am I gonna get put on sanitary sewer? And you know what he told me? He said, Lauren, if you talk to every single homeowner on your block
Yeah.
and you get them all to commit to pay their $10,000 to $15,000 of private side connection, I will build the sanitary sewer line on your blocks. I have a day job, and so I have not come around to knocking on the doors of all of my neighbors, but I told him that I would do it. I would do it. But transitioning septic to sewer, certainly in really vulnerable low-lying areas, the ones closest to the bay, is a huge priority for Miami-Dade County. And the state of Florida has actually given us at least $10 million every year for the past 4 or 5 years to help with that transition. Our water and sewer department is doing really thoughtful stuff like creating a revolving loan fund. Because we know that that last $10,000, again, that piece that the resident is responsible for oftentimes holds people back, right? Like, again, your point, people have decisions to make. People have rising rents. People have to pay for 3 cars in their multi-generational house because they can't rely on public transit. Lots of times people aren't in a position to also pay for the private side connection. And so we're actually in the midst of launching this revolving loan fund that will actually say, hey, we will give you this very low, if not 0% interest loan, if you agree to actually use it on the private side connection, because the county is putting forth the other, millions of dollars to actually get your neighborhood on sewer. And just in sort of broader infrastructure, the county has actually been really successful in pulling down infrastructure dollars. This federal administration has put a lot of money into infrastructure. And so between the state and the federal government, we've successfully pulled down over $1 billion for infrastructure, which is a really big deal. And in the next 2 years, the mayor is going to launch another bond program. So I don't think any of the students here were around when we did our first bond program, but she really wants to launch this to address specifically the aging infrastructure that we know is a huge component of trying to address resiliency across this community. This was going to be my last slide, this beautiful picture of Biscayne Bay. But last night in the throes of preparation, I instead changed my last slide to this. Those are my 2 cats. I love them. They're so cute. They're regular people living in Miami-Dade County. And the reason why I'm putting them up there is because if you take nothing else from this presentation, like really the only thing that I hope that you take from this is what you're doing is so critically important. It's like good science, sound science has to be the anchor of all of the policy decisions that local governments are making. But as you develop your science and your expertise, just remember that it's me, it's my cats, it's your neighbor who just paved over their entire lawn, who has to be convinced that what you're selling them is valuable, that what you're selling them is worth the investment. So just know your craft, know your science so intimately that you can inspire other people who may not have the same level of either education or comfort level. Know your stuff so intimately that you can actually inspire behavior change. Because it's me and them and regular people who are living here in Miami-Dade County and maybe don't have the opportunity to think about a lot of these issues on a day-to-day basis the way that some of us do. So that's the end of my presentation. That's my contact info. Thank you guys so much. I'm so happy to be here.